This week, Prime Minister Chris Hipkins visited China to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping for the first time. Hipkins previously stated that their discussion would be focused on trade and tourism, despite concerns about China's ongoing human rights abuses against Uyghur people and their treatment of Taiwan. First, News and editorial director Jessica speaks to Jeffrey Miller, a geopolitical analyst at the Democracy Project, about why Hipkins is focusing on our economic relationship with China.
Can you tell us what was discussed at the Prime Minister's meeting with China?
Well, we've got Chris Hipkins' account of the meeting so far, so we've got the New Zealand perspective, and according to Hipkins, the focus was mainly on economics, and there's no surprise there given that China is New Zealand's biggest trading partner by some margin, and we send around $20 billion of exports to China every year, so it's no surprise that economics was the main focus, but there were other issues discussed, the war in Ukraine, the situation in the Pacific, and human rights were all discussed according to Chris Hipkins, and some other things as well. So they packed quite a lot into just a 40 minutes.
And we saw that Hipkins recently declined to call the Chinese President Xi Jinping a dictator. Why do you think Hipkins is shying away a bit from openly criticising China for their human rights abuses?
As I said, China is New Zealand's biggest trading partner at the end of the day, and it's a very sensitive relationship. New Zealand prides itself on what it calls an independent foreign policy, and not simply echoing what our bigger partners might happen to think, whether it be Canberra or Washington. And I think that's what you saw there, that Hipkins just declined to go along with that description. Obviously, Joe Biden is the leader of a very powerful country, and more powerful, bigger countries can perhaps afford to do things that smaller countries can't. Chris Hipkins has got to be very sensitive and very aware of Chinese sentiment and Chinese feelings, and he knew that if he endorsed that description of a dictator, that would be very offensive to the Chinese side and would certainly be not conducive to his visit to China this week. In fact, that visit this week probably wouldn't have gone ahead, I think, if Chris Hipkins had endorsed that description of Xi as a dictator. That's the description that Joe Biden used. So, I think that it's a sensitive relationship at the end of the day, and Chris Hipkins is reflecting that.
On China's side, what do you speculate they would be hoping to get from this meeting?
Well, I think for China, there are a lot of reasons to have a meeting with New Zealand. New Zealand is a Five Eyes country, so it's one of the 5 English-speaking countries, and New Zealand has the best relationship out of all of them with China. There hasn't been a top-level meeting between a New Zealand Prime Minister and Xi Jinping in China since 2019, so it was high time for a meeting. This meeting had been signalled for quite a few months now. Jacinda Ardern at the end of last year said she was hoping to go to China early in the new year. It was delayed. We're not quite sure exactly what the reasons are for that, but in the end it did come through in the end. And China likes New Zealand, I think, while China is very important for New Zealand in terms of trade. The inverse is not really 100% true, because in the end, New Zealand is only a small country of 5 million people. But I think New Zealand does provide something of an example that China can hold up to the world in terms of its relationships with other Western countries. And the fact it's got a good relationship with New Zealand can then be used as evidence with other Western countries that perhaps they could also learn lessons from New Zealand. So I think China likes New Zealand as a role model for other Western countries. And look, it is a positive relationship. New Zealand does have a good working relationship with China, which is a big deal for a country of New Zealand's size. And we really do need China, just given how much of our exports do go there. We rely on China for our economic well-being, our economic livelihood at the end of the day, whether you like it or not. Over a quarter of our trade goes to China every year, a quarter of our exports. So, without other options, we actually do really need to keep on good terms with China, in my view.
Can you go into a bit more detail about that sort of economic relationship and sort of what we are offering China and vice versa?
Well, New Zealand exports particularly agricultural products to China, so a lot of our milk powder, really, the vast bulk of it, in fact, goes to China. So it's a hugely important market for our agricultural exports, which do make up the vast bulk of what New Zealand produces. So that's really what's in it for us. It's our farmers that really are very much dependent on China, and there are lots of other products as well. Forestry is another one, all the logs and the raw materials for China's industrial base that it needs for its production. And remember, China acts in many ways as the world's factory floor, sending out finished goods to the rest of the world. New Zealand is feeding into that model. We're sending raw materials to China, and then much of what New Zealand sends to China is then at some point getting re-exported elsewhere, or some of it's being consumed domestically in China as well. But we're in a different position to Australia, which sends a lot of iron ore and a lot of minerals to China, which really are used in the factories in China. So New Zealand, to some extent, is exporting goods that are less valuable to China. In some sense, they're perhaps less of a bargaining chip than what Australia has got with those real metals and minerals, those goods that are needed for producing all kinds of manufactured.
Like you mentioned, the US has been quite openly critical of China. How has New Zealand kind of sat with countries like the US and other Western countries on issues like the US's allegations of spying and China's growing influence in the Pacific as well?
Yeah, New Zealand walks a fine line with all of these things. I think New Zealand has become a lot friendlier towards the Western position, if there is one, and a more China-critical point of view. I think if you look over the past year, you had Jacinda Ardern meeting Joe Biden at the White House, and they issued quite a hawkish joint statement. You had a statement just issued recently on economic coercion that was clearly aimed at China that New Zealand signed up to, along with other Five Eyes countries and Japan. So I think New Zealand, in many ways, has become more hawkish as relations between the West and China have deteriorated. There's a lot of pressure on New Zealand from the likes of Australia and the US to join them and being more sceptical of China, more critical of China. New Zealand, I think, does best when it takes its own position, when it listens to all the things it's being told by its partners and by China, by everyone, and then makes its own decisions. And I think that's, in the end, what New Zealand's independent foreign policy is. And we will, at times, speak out in different ways, all for different reasons. I think the whole dictator controversy that we had last week was an example of that. Chris Hipkins was not criticising Joe Biden. He was simply saying what New Zealand's position was, and he did not believe she was a dictator and that their method of government was up to them. So he was not going to get involved. And that goes down well with China, which is very protective of what it sees as interference in its domestic affairs. So by not getting involved and not commenting, Chris Hipkins was doing the right thing by them, by Beijing. It was very interesting to see the line that Chris Hipkins used. He repeated the phrase warm and constructive no fewer than 8 times in his press conference with New Zealand media after his meeting with Xi Jinping. So that's clearly the underlying message that he wants to get home is that New Zealand-Chinese ties are in a good phase and that they are in a friendly phase. And there have been some discussions over the Nai Mahuta, the foreign minister, and her meeting with her Chinese counterpart in March. And there was a leak that came out at the weekend which said that she received an ear bashing from her Chinese counterpart. So I think Chris Hipkins was eager to smooth over that and was very keen to smooth over any perceived tensions between New Zealand and China. And just the fact that New Zealand has been drifting towards a more US-friendly foreign policy position over the past year or so, particularly in relation to things like the Pacific. So I think Chris Hipkins was keen to turn the page on New Zealand-China relations.
That was Jeffrey Miller from the Democracy Project speaking about China's relationship with Aotearoa.